Defund the Legislature and the dumbest bill in America. This is Mark Fisher with Mark and the Millennials. And the millennial joining me today is, of course, our producer, Christopher Hopkins. Welcome, Christopher. Great to see you again.
You too, Mark.
It was really nice to spend time in Western Florida, Southwestern Florida to be exact. What a beautiful area of the country. There's nothing much more beautiful with the natural beauty, I should say, than the Gulf of Mexico. Absolutely a beautiful body of water. And the people are really nice, too. And you don't have to wear a mask everywhere you go. I just want to say that was a fun place to go for about 8 days. So this podcast is called Defund the Legislature, and of course, the dumbest bill in America. And who is trying to potentially defund the legislature? Well, that would be Texas Governor Abbott, because the Democrats in the legislature decided to just walk out. Because the Republicans who control the legislature in Texas decided, how dare they, by the way, they decided that it was important to have a voting integrity bill, especially after watching what had happened across the country with voting rules and laws being changed by courts and not by legislatures. So the Texas governor decided, you know what? We need to have our own bill to shore up our voting process and to make it more reliable. Well, what do you think happened? The Democrats decided that, well, you can't have a quorum in the legislature in Texas if the Democrats walk out. So they decided to walk out, and therefore the legislature had to, of course, adjourn. So the Texas governor may bring them back in a special session. In fact, I think you can count on it. And in the meantime, he said he's going to veto funding for the state legislature amid the spat over the election bill. So the Texas governor can actually not pay the Democrats because they didn't show up as they are hired to do by the citizens in their respective districts. They did not show up to the legislature. So therefore, why pay them? Well, in the legislature in Texas, they make, I think, a little over $7,000 per year, which, by the way, I have to admit is pretty extraordinary because my own state legislators make $50,000, a little bit more than $50,000 a year, which I've always thought was too much personally. And because what it does is it encourages people to treat it as a job and a career rather than as just public service. And in the Texas legislature, which meets every other year, they get paid a lot less. So here's the article from Fox News. Texas Governor Greg Abbott said Monday that he would veto the portion of the state budget that funds the legislative branch one day after Democrat lawmakers blocked a Republican-backed election bill in the House. In a tweet announcing the move, Governor Abbott indicated that his decision was a response to lawmakers who abandoned their responsibilities. The Texas governor was a strong advocate for the passage of the elections bill. I will veto Article 10 of the budget passed by the legislature. Article 10 funds the legislative branch, Governor Abbott said. No pay for those who abandon their responsibilities. Stay tuned. And that was a tweet that Governor Abbott sent out. Abbott's action came hours after Democrat lawmakers left the House floor and broke quorum ahead of a planned vote on Senate Bill 7, a measure which had drawn widespread criticism from the party. As a result of the protest, the Texas House was unable to hold a vote on the bill prior to a midnight deadline. That's because there weren't enough members to make a quorum, because the Democrats just walked off and took all their toys out of the sandbox and went home and cried to mama. So Texas Democrat State Representative Jean Wu slammed Governor Abbott over the planned veto. Here is what Jean Wu said, quote, punishing working class office staff, maintenance, and other support services because he didn't get every single one of his demands is very on brand for Texas Republicans, Wu tweeted. In other words, as the governor is going to use Article 10 to defund the legislature, good old Representative Wu, Jean Wu, said, well, the governor's trying to not pay the staffers who work really hard. Well, you know what? Maybe the staffers shouldn't be working for Democrats who don't actually want to show up and vote. Look, I'll be frank with you. There have been many times in the legislature, a legislature that I belong to, where Democrats have a supermajority, that I've thought to myself, you know what I should do? I should just walk out, and that's really going to show them. No, it's not. They're just going to go and pass it eventually anyway. So I'm much better off being armed with my intellect and my values and my principles and arguing on the floor and trying to work through that process than I am walking away, because the citizens didn't send you there to walk away. It's just a really bad idea. But that's not going to stop Democrats, because whenever it comes to shoring up the vote and giving people confidence about the way they vote and voting integrity, you can always count on Democrats to just, say, I'm not going to support that because you're trying to take away the right to vote from people who are Black and Hispanic, which of course nothing could be further from the truth. So we have another article on this. It's from NPR. And of course, if you know anything about national public radio, it's very left-leaning. And NPR, here is their take on this. NPR said, Texas Democrats walk out to block voting restrictions. Governor threatens no pay. Voting restrictions. I always think that's funny, right? Voting restrictions. Republicans say voter integrity. Democrats say, no, voting restrictions. You're trying to take away the franchise. So here's what NPR said. Texas Governor Greg Abbott says he intends to withhold paychecks to state lawmakers after House Democrats staged a walkout to block voting restrictions proposed by their Republican counterparts. A large group of Democrats walked out of the House chamber in Austin late Sunday, so there was no quorum, and that prevented a final vote on the proposed Senate Bill 7. The bill, which had appeared poised for passage, would cut back polling hours, reduce access to mail-in voting, and give more authority to partisan poll watchers. So let me say that again. This is NPR. The bill, which had appeared poised for passage, would cut back polling hours, reduce access to mail-in voting, and give more authority to partisan poll watchers. Voting rights advocates say those and other provisions of the bill would make voting more difficult in Texas and would disproportionately burden people of color. There's never been evidence of significant voter fraud in Texas or elsewhere. How do we know that? I'm pretty sure that that's not true, according to NPR. On Twitter, Abbott said he would veto Article 10 of the state budget, which funds the legislative branch. No pay for those who abandon their responsibilities, he said. He did not provide further details, but added, stay tuned. So the article continues, NPR, I just have to read this last paragraph. The fight in the Texas legislature comes as Republican state lawmakers across the country work to pass legislation they say is designed to crack down on voter fraud, but which would have the effect of making voting more difficult in many communities. Nonsense, NPR. Lawmakers in several states have introduced similar legislation motivated at least in part by former President Donald Trump's continued promotion of the big lie that the 2020 election was somehow stolen despite evidence to the contrary. Those states include Georgia, where Democrats prevailed in the presidential contest for the first time in 30 years, thanks in large part to grassroots organizers such as Stacey Abrams, who worked to turn out younger voters and people of color ahead of Election Day. So that is NPR's take on it. Republicans are trying to restrict voter access. So to better understand this bill and the various opinions and commentators who talk about this bill and other bills like it, we have, first up, Fox News reporting. Then we're going to give you a contrast with CNN and NBC Today Show. What they say, you can only imagine what they say. So first up, here's Fox News reporting on this bill. Here it is.
On early voting, the liberal narrative is that the bill makes it difficult to vote early. The fact is, the bill generally requires early voting for at least 9 hours per day between 6 a.m. and 9 p.m. Let me read you one more. The liberal narrative is that the bill prevents voting by mail. The fact is, the bill continues to allow voting by mail, though with new restrictions on unsolicited applications. What's wrong with that?
So that's Fox News kind of going over, Fox Business News, mind you, going over just a few of the provisions in the bill. So the bill does not allow you to solicit votes from individuals by calling on their behalf to get an absentee ballot. So just to make this clear, what happened in the 2020 elections are, as you all know, is that in certain states, especially swing states, the legislatures put in rules, but courts overruled the legislatures and said, we're going to just do a mass mail-out voting to everybody, an actual live ballot. What could go wrong? Of course, what happened if the live ballot got in someone else's hands? It didn't really matter because you just fill it out and there are drop boxes everywhere. So there's really no voter integrity. And basically Texas is saying, we're not going to allow that anymore. Can you indeed in Texas request an absentee ballot? Yes, you can. But we're not going to let it be unrestricted. That is to say, we're not going to allow local governments and local election boards in the state of Texas to go ahead and do mass mail out and then mail in balloting just in their particular jurisdictions. We're not going to allow that. So they wanted a uniform election law to make sure that there wasn't this endless voting, that is to say 24-hour voting, which, by the way, apparently was happening in Houston, Texas. You know what they were doing in Houston? They had drive-through voting centers. Drive-through. So you don't actually get out of your car. It's like a drive-through voting center. And it was 24 hours a day. So imagine all you would have to do, since you had mass mail-out voting of the ballots, is just go ballot harvest hundreds, if not thousands of ballots, have them filled out. You could even fill them out yourself, and then go through the Houston's 24-hour voting, system and just kind of like, hey, I'm going to open my window up. Here's like a whole bag full of ballots. What could go wrong here? Any concern about voter integrity, Democrats? Of course not. Democrats aren't concerned about voter integrity. Not in places like Houston. What they care about is this idea that you're trying to restrict people from voting. Yet in the state of Texas, you have 9 hours a day of early voting. Okay. And so here's CNN's take on this particular voting bill. And you're going to appreciate this contrast. Here it is.
A bill that contains things like banning voting past 9 o'clock at night. It would ban the unsolicited mailing of ballot applications, would also prohibit overnight and early Sunday morning voting. It would expand the access that partisan poll watchers would have at polling locations. It would stop drive-through voting as well. And one of the bigger concerns that many people here have in Texas is that they say it would lower the standard of proof for being able for judges to be able to overturn an election. So those are many of the issues that have been so controversial in this voting
All of
bill.
which are untrue, by the way. All of which are untrue because in Texas you have early voting, 9 hours a day. In Texas, you can still request an absentee ballot. In Texas, you have to show an ID when you vote. And in Texas, this particular law prohibits these 24-hour voting, drive-through voting centers in places like Houston. And at the same time in Texas, they're like, well, you can't actually electioneer while people are standing in line, which, by the way, happened in my own home district, where we had leftist activists that weren't even from the area who went down the line, which was 2 hours long, by the way, hundreds and hundreds of people when we were voting last November. And these individuals were passing out bottles of water and food. And they, at the same time, were wearing, obviously far leftist propaganda and just saying, oh, we're just here to feed you and give you water while you're waiting in line. But we're not going to try to electioneer or influence your vote, which is something that, by the way, was already prohibited in state law in my own state. And other states are basically saying, look, this is something that the left was doing nationwide, and we want to make sure that it stops. We want to make sure that it's not allowed, because you are allowed to have a table within a certain amount of feet of the place where you vote. Usually it's 50 feet. Sometimes it's farther away. That's certainly the case in our state. But what was happening is because of the pandemic, they were using this as an excuse to just break every rule and go to you while you were waiting in line and say, Sir, would you like to have a bottle of water? Would you like a candy bar? Oh, by the way, guess where I'm from? I'm from progressive Maryland, and I just gave you that free stuff. Remember that. By the way, here's, something you should look at that's kind of like a sample ballot you might want to take a look at when you walk in there. And states across the country, especially the Republican states, without question, are actually communicating with each other and saying, look, this is something the left did systematically across the country, and it ought not be allowed because it is voter intimidation. Imagine if you did this in an all black district or an all Hispanic district or an all Asian district, and that those districts, just for sake of argument, were overwhelmingly Democrat and you were Republican, telling them to vote for Donald Trump, and you were handing out water and candy bars and so forth. There would be people that would be triggered and upset. That's why we don't allow it. That's why it's not allowed. So here's another compare and contrast. Here's NBC's Today Show reporting on this Texas bill. Listen to how they describe it. Here it is.
Many GOP officials admit the 2020 election was secure, and Texas had no reports of mass voter fraud in 2020. This is all part of a nationwide battle with the GOP aiming to put tougher restrictions in place, driven by former President Trump's lie that the 2020 election was stolen. But look,
you have to understand, if you're a reporter, and which this gentleman purportedly is, and you're working for NBC, what you would normally report is, hey, look, there are Republicans. They control the legislature in Texas. They're interested in providing more voter integrity. Here's what the Republicans consider to be voter integrity, and then go down the list. And Democrats, by the way, this is what a reporter would say, a good reporter, Democrats disagree because they say it restricts voting for these reasons. It restricts voting. And in the 2020 election, there was a lot of disagreement, and that continues to this day, that the election was either stolen or, and this is what people have been saying, of course, for many months, or at the very least, the election was unfair because you had Mark Zuckerberg flowing Zuckerbucks all over the country. And in addition to that, you had laws being changed, voting laws being changed, not by state legislatures, but by courts, and sometimes by election officials themselves. And if you went over those things as a reporter and you actually talked about them in a systematic way and a very calm way, I think you would get a lot more buy-in and a lot more discussion, but they don't. Immediately they say, well, there's nothing to look at during the 2020 election that happened that was wrong. Nothing happened in the 2020 election that was in any way, shape, or form sneaky or underhanded or questionable. I have to tell you something. If you're a Democrat or an independent and you're listening to this podcast, thank you, by the way, you have to ask yourself, do you really think it's appropriate for there to be mass mail-out and mass mail-in ballots in the state of Pennsylvania, just as an example? Do you really think that's appropriate? Do you further think it's appropriate to accept ballots after the evening of the election itself? So you have an election, there's an election day, and you're a Democrat and you're a state elected official, or you're an election judge, or just a judge who was appointed to a job or elected to a job, and you decide that the election is never really going to end. So election day isn't really election day when you stop collecting and receiving ballots. You say, well, we're going to continue to accept them many days after this election day, which is what happened. Any reasonable person, regardless of party, has to understand how incredibly unfair that is, and that it's cheating. It's cheating because you have an election day. You have early voting that occurs all the way up to that election day. And election day, you can even still drop off at your local drop box or to the actual election judge your mail-in ballot, or you can vote in person, which is what I personally prefer. But that we just have these people, they don't seem to understand that the entire process was undermined by this mass mail-in voting when you had these mail-in votes coming in significantly after the election day. And so Texas is basically saying, look, we're going to shore up our election system because we don't want anyone to say that an election in Texas was unfair or that there was potential cheating, or that we have 24-hour voting drive-through centers, which is like, I'm just wondering if you vote, let's say at 1 o'clock in the morning, because you're dropping off your ballot. I mean, why can't you? I understand people. Don't get mad at me out there. I understand people work for a living. I work for a living. And maybe you have a job where you have really long hours, 4 days a week or 5 days a week. That's why we also have voting on weekends, early voting, which exists in the state of Texas and many other states as well. So I just don't understand the media's take on this late date, trying to say that there was nothing to see in the 2020 election, and Republicans, the bad Republicans, are trying to restrict access to the vote by people of all colors because of the fact that they want either voter ID or they want the elections to end at election day, which seems to me to be a perfectly reasonable thing. Instead, we have election month and sometimes election week, even after election day, which continues, as we know it's intended so that until the result is reached, then we actually start counting and we stop the election. That is exactly what happened in Pennsylvania. And any reasonable person to this day would say, I have a question mark. I'm not going to sit here to podcast listeners and say, I 100% know that this person won or that person won in Pennsylvania. This is what I'm going to tell you. I am certain that there was a lot of shenanigans going on in Pennsylvania as a result of the mass mail-in ballots and the fact that so many of them came in after the election day. It seems very, very sketchy to me. So good for the Governor Abbott of Texas, who is actually doing something about this, including, which this is the part I love the best, defunding the state legislative office holders because of the fact that the Democrats won't show up. And you and I both know this. Democrats get elected for the money. And look, this I can tell you firsthand. I know so many Democrats who have gotten elected and hold a job teaching at a state college. So remember, it's a state college. The state college pays them with state taxpayer dollars. Then, in addition to that, they get elected, go to the state legislature, and they get paid with state taxpayer dollars. And then while they're in the legislature, they're absent from their state job at the college for 90 days during the legislature, and they're getting paid in both jobs by the state taxpayers with state taxpayer dollars. So let me get this straight. You work for the state in two separate jobs, you're getting two incomes from the state taxpayers, and one of the jobs, you don't show up for 90 days, and yet you still get paid all of those 90 days. I mean, what could go wrong? And is there any conflict of interest when you're in the state and you vote for budgets that fund and give you more money in your state college job? Oh, they all vote for those. They never recuse themselves from those jobs. Never from those votes, I should say. So this is something that I've seen time and time again, and good for the Texas governor for defunding the legislature. So next up, podcast listeners, MSNBC received a backlash on Tuesday for airing a chyron during Andrea Mitchell reports that said Texas two-step while showing a picture of Texas Governor Greg Abbott, who's a Republican in Texas, and the governor, who is in a wheelchair, in a teaser for the upcoming segment on Texas's controversial new election bill. So MSNBC received a backlash on Tuesday for airing on the chyron during Andrea Mitchell reports that said the Texas two-step while Greg Abbott was sitting in his wheelchair. Obviously, it is very disrespectful to the governor of Texas. And so all these individuals are coming back at MSNBC and complaining, and others, like Hot Air's Ed Morrissey, I think it's a podcast, gave the network the benefit of the doubt that perhaps it didn't realize how the chyron would translate, but he added sarcastically, dude. So what the hell is this, MSNBC, did they say? making fun of Greg Abbott, Texas, because he can't walk. And so that was, of course, MSNBC saying, well, the Texas two-step, because it's a one-step, two-step, because Greg Abbott is trying to, really pull one over on the voters, pull wool over the voters' faces, because, he's trying to show them that, he's going to pass his voter integrity bill, but really it's about stopping people from voting. It's about voter restrictions. And so then they use the term Texas two-step and show the governor in a wheelchair because of the fact that he can't walk. So Abbott, here's the background on this, just so you understand. And podcast listeners, I didn't know this myself. I did not know this myself. Governor Abbott was 26 years old and had recently graduated from law school in 1984 when he was struck by a large oak tree during a jog that cracked and fell on his back, leaving him paralyzed from the waist down. I didn't know that. Through this experience, Governor Abbott learned that our lives aren't defined by our challenges, his office wrote of the governor's accident. Instead, we define our lives by how we respond to those challenges. His triumph over tragedy shows that Governor Greg Abbott doesn't back down from challenges, but uses his lessons and perseverance to overcome them. Abbott has previously faced attacks from liberals for being in a wheelchair. Can you imagine? During the 2014 gubernatorial race, his Democrat opponent Wendy Davis aired an ad that opened with an image of a wheelchair and then criticized Abbott for allegedly not doing enough to help other victims, despite himself receiving a large monetary settlement after a falling branch paralyzed him. Abbott has been a frequent target of the media during the pandemic. In March, he was ripped by pundits, including MSNBC's anchors, for completely reopening Texas and lifting its mask mandate. MSNBC anchor Stephanie Ruhle wondered on air if states like Texas should face consequences for not following the CDC, asking, should they get access to, let's say, emergency federal help if they end up with a spike in cases or hospitalizations down the road? But Abbott was happy to announce last month that Texas has reported 0 COVID-related deaths for the first time since March of 2020. But that didn't stop MSNBC from posting and putting on their chyron on their channel, Greg Abbott is doing the Texas two-step and showing a picture of him in his wheelchair. Can you imagine if a Republican did that? I mean, it would just be something that would be unsustainable for the Republican. They might even have to resign because of the cancel culture of, and let's face it, it is crossing the line, because this governor has really done a great job in the state. It's a highly complicated state to govern. It's a massive state. It's bigger than most countries. I think it's one of the largest economies in the world. And yet that's all MSNBC can do. And why, ladies and gentlemen, are they doing it? Because it's all about stopping voter integrity. That's all they care about. The Democrats want so badly to flip the state of Texas and to permanently flip the state of Georgia and to permanently flip the state of North Carolina and to flip the state of Florida, because they want complete and utter control. And the only way they can get it is if they try to disparage the Republicans who are trying to push forward these voter integrity bills. And so MSNBC really blew it on this one, right? Because here's a guy who's been he's had a great misfortune by not being able to walk and being in a wheelchair. Nonetheless, MSNBC decides to do this. And I just think their viewers just don't care. I mean, what kind of cold viewers do they have who actually don't really care about people's personal well-being and have no sympathy? But that's MSNBC. It's all about political power. It's all about ratings. It's all about selling advertisement. So here's MSNBC. Listen to how Nicole Wallace introduces a segment with Michael Steele, he's the former RNC chair, talking about voter ID. Now, to be fair, Michael Steele was talking about voter ID in Georgia, and we're talking about Texas, but these are the Republican states that are controlled by Republicans in the state legislature who are trying to implement these voter integrity bills. Yet, of course, Michael Steele thinks it's a bad idea because apparently people of color can't figure out how to get an ID, even though IDs are free. And everybody has one because you can't get welfare without it. And you also can't get many other services without an ID. And you certainly can't get on a plane without an ID. And you certainly can't get into many other private places with an ID. You certainly need an ID when you often pay with a credit card or pay with a check. You typically need an ID when you go to the doctor because they want to make sure it's really you. I mean, we can just go on and on and on, but not when you vote, of course, according to good old Michael Steele, former RNC chair. So here he is on MSNBC, and Nicole Wallace. Here we got it.
You can start with the question to the party. So what the hell are you afraid of? You know, if you put out good candidates, you put out a strong message, you have principles and policies that align with where America is. Why do you need to rig the system so you can win? And as we've already seen from the 2018 election, rigging the system doesn't get you the win.
Yeah, there you go. So rigging the system. So voter ID, according to the infamous Michael Steele, is rigging the system. So not knowing who is actually voting, whether it is by mail or whether it's through the whole ballot harvesting fiasco, or whether just showing up at, I don't know, a half a dozen or more election precincts in any given week and voting on behalf of others in person because no ID is required. That would be pretty easy to do, ladies and gentlemen. In fact, it would be the easiest thing ever to do because you just go to election precincts where you clearly don't know anyone. So in another county, you go to 10 election precincts over the course of the early voting period, even the voting day of voting. You vote in person. And all they want to know typically is, what is your address? And what is your name? And obviously it's pretty easy to ascertain or cheat or steal that information from others that you know aren't going to vote. Or even if you know they're going to vote, you could potentially just vote in their stead and they wouldn't even know until they showed up. Does this happen in the United States? Of course it does, in those areas that don't have voter ID. You know it and I know it. But of course, MSNBC could care less because, and certainly Michael Steele doesn't care because it's rigging. So Beto O'Rourke has a stop in Wichita Falls, Texas this weekend for his voting rights tour. And as you can recall, he's the guy that Beto O'Rourke who ran against Ted Cruz and also wants to ban so-called AR-15s and pretty much any other so-called weapon that you're able to legally have under the Second Amendment. And he's doing his little dog and pony dance across the state because he thinks that this whole Texas integrity bill for voter integrity is wrong. Because obviously Beto doesn't have a job, right? He's wealthy. I think he was wealthy personally, and he married someone who was wealthy. So he's kind of wealthy by two. And he doesn't have a real job. So his job is to basically campaign 24/7, which is what Democrats do everywhere, right? They really don't have actual, the elected Democrats. It's not fair. Some have jobs, okay? Some have real jobs. But increasingly what I'm seeing is so many elected Democrats, their jobs are working for unions. And so the union funds them full-time to run for office. So their job really is to campaign. They're paid to campaign. Or they're working for nonprofits that also pay them full-time to campaign. Or they're working, as or college. I think I've mentioned that earlier. Some colleges, of course, certainly in the state that I'm from, they only hire Democrat operatives. They love Democrat operatives, in fact, when they hire them as professors or as visiting lecturers that get paid. Why? Because they can also go to the legislature, those same individuals, and advocate for the college. So there's this vicious circle of spending that never seems to end. And so whenever we wonder why Democrats like spending so much, that's why it just works so well. So podcast listeners, the Minneapolis BLM founder has decided that he rejects critical race theory and the whole BLM nonsense. So in the Daily Wire, the founder of Black Lives Matter in St. Paul says, I resigned after I learned the ugly truth as an insider of BLM. Rashard Turner, the founder of Black Lives Matter chapter in St. Paul, Minnesota, revealed in a video published last week that he quit the organization after he learned the ugly truth while being an insider in the far left group. Turner made the remarks in a video published by Take Charge, a Black-led organization that rejects critical race theory and woke culture. In the video, Turner talks about his background and his life and how it is that he got into the organization thinking it was going to be a good thing for Black people and for all people of color for that matter, and then realized actually it was antithetical to everything that he had accomplished in his life and that Black people need in order to accomplish in their lives. We have a piece of this clip, and here it is.
I believe the organization stood for exactly what the name implies. Black lives do matter. However, after a year on the inside, I learned they had little concern for rebuilding Black families, and they cared even less about improving the quality of education for students in Minneapolis. That was made clear when they publicly denounced charter schools alongside the teachers union. I was an insider in Black Lives Matter, and I learned the ugly truth. The moratorium on charter schools does not support rebuilding the Black family, but it does create barriers to a better education for Black children. I resigned from Black Lives Matter after a year and a half.
Yeah, so he resigned because he had gone to school. His grandparents raised him. Very common story in the Black communities, and unfortunately, but the grandparents raised him, really encouraged him to study, and really encouraged education and enforced education. And so he made great sacrifices, as many of us do, and went to higher ed and graduated from college. Then realized that BLM wasn't really about the nuclear family, wasn't really about education, because they formed a partnership with the teachers union. And the teachers union, of course, very smartly partnered with BLM because they realized that they could convince the BLM leadership to not support charter schools or school choice. Can you imagine? The one thing, ladies and gentlemen, that would make Black lives matter in the United States of America would be school choice. Choosing the school that best fits your needs and having the public school dollars follow you to go to any school that you wanted to go to. And yet, the teachers union partnered with and allied with BLM leadership to convince them that the real reason they're being held down isn't because of the really crummy schools they go to in the inner cities, but the real reason they're being held down is because of systemic racism. And yet it's the teachers unions and the Democrat Party that is committing systemic racism on Black people in cities because they won't give them school choice. I mean, this is not hard. This isn't hard at all. And yet we finally have information from a single individual that was part of this group in Minneapolis, St. Paul, the BLM branch there, that's giving us information about what BLM is really about. It's not about making Black lives better. BLM is about Marxism. BLM is about political power. And there are so many of us who know that the way forward is education and the way forward is school choice. And we've talked about this many times in this podcast. But isn't it refreshing, ladies and gentlemen, to finally hear someone who was part of BLM, who left, and once left is talking openly with this video on YouTube about what really should matter in Black lives and what we're not doing? It's just fascinating. So get this, podcast listeners. The parents of a school, I think it's Dalton School, but I'll clarify this in a moment. The parents are enraged over a video showed to their first graders. A video showed to their first graders in the first grade class that talks about, of all things, masturbation. So, in the New York Post, of course, this happened in New York. Last fall, parents at the posh $55,000 per year Dalton School got wind of their first graders being taught sex education lessons that included masturbation. You heard that correctly. They complained to school administrators, but were told that they had simply misinterpreted what Dalton's now notorious health and wellness educator, Justine Ang-Fonte, who last month led a controversial and explicit porn literacy workshop at another elite prep school. I want to say this again. I got to read this again. They complained, the parents did, to school administrators at the Dalton School, which is a private school, but the parents were told that they had simply misinterpreted what the Dalton School's now notorious health and wellness educator, Justine Ang-Fonte, who last month led a controversial and explicit porn literacy workshop at another elite prep school. They didn't understand what she was teaching. It was just a misunderstanding because, she's teaching first graders about masturbation, among other things, in a video. And then in another elite prep school, she's making sure that there's porn literacy. But after the Post's expose last week on the porn class, Dalton parents bombarded the school with more complaints about Fonte's curriculum, sources told the Post. The Post viewed video of a cartoon Fonte used in one of her sex ed classes for 6-year-olds, showing little kids talking about touching themselves for pleasure. How come sometimes my penis gets big sometimes and it points in the air, asks the little boy in the cartoon. Well, rather than me reading this to you, how about if I just show you the video, and if you can watch it, that's great. But if you're listening to the podcast, listening is enough. Here it is.
Do you notice that when you say pee-pee, you giggle, but when you say penis, you say it in a serious voice?
I never noticed that before.
Some children and adults feel uncomfortable when they talk about their private parts, so they make up cute or funny names for them.
What's one for a girl's private parts?
Vajayjay!
Said no one I know into a first grader, but that is the first part of what was shown to these children in a cartoon. And obviously the cartoon has adults that are trying to make themselves sound like children in the animation. We have a second part of this that you have got to listen to, and here it is.
Hey, how come my penis gets big sometimes and points up in the air?
That's called an erection.
Sometimes I touch my penis because it feels good.
Sometimes when I'm in my bath or when Mom puts me to bed, I like to touch my vulva too.
You have a clitoris there, Kayla, that probably feels good to touch the same way Keith's penis feels good when he touches it. But have you ever noticed that older kids and grown-ups don't touch their private parts in public?
They don't?
That's right, Keith. It's okay to touch yourself and see how different body parts feel, but it's best to only do it in private.
Well, if private parts are so special, why do you cover them up?
Because they are private, silly.
That's right, Kayla, because they are private.
So there you go. These are first graders who are watching this video. So the animation was, of course, backed up by adults talking like they were children. And the first graders in the classroom were shown this animation. And this is what the Dalton School continues to believe is appropriate for first graders. And God knows what's happening in many of the public schools, but this is a private school where people are actually paying a lot of money, $50,000 a year, by the way, to send your kid there so that your child can learn, of all things, something that, as far as I'm concerned, has no place in an elementary school anywhere on the face of the earth. But yet this is happening so many different places because the crazies who run these schools hire these consultants who try to sexualize children. And here's what I was thinking yesterday when I read the story. I was thinking, wouldn't it be great if somewhere in America an attorney general, a state attorney general, would send in the police because they wrote a complaint against the school and the individual, the school head, the head of the school, which in a private school, they call them a school head. In a public school, it's a school principal. And they arrested the school principal, and then they arrested the individual teaching this curriculum and charged them with child pornography and endangerment. It's about time that this happens because this is not education, ladies and gentlemen. It's not. It's not. And so here's what the New York Post, by the way, says further. It says, Fonte, who's the lady that's teaching this, lessons for first graders also include subjects such as gender assigned at birth for first graders, gender identity, and gender expression. Imagine teaching that to first graders. Kids have no less than 5 classes on gender identity. This is pure indoctrination, a Dalton mother said. This person should absolutely not be teaching children. Ironically, she teaches kids about consent, yet she has never gotten consent from parents about the sexually explicit and age-appropriate material about transgenders to first graders. We are furious, a third Dalton mother told the Post. We were horrified to learn this was shown to our first grade 6 and 7-year-old kids without our knowledge or consent, but it's so hard to fight back because you'll get canceled and your child will suffer. Folks, just pull your kids out of the school. This is why school choice is important, right? Something happens that fundamentally you oppose, something that is not consistent with your principles and with your mores and with your job as a parent. And so you fire the school and you go somewhere else. That is the right thing to do. Kind of common sense, ladies and gentlemen, just fire the school and move on. But wouldn't it be great if the Attorney General of the state of New York sent in some police officers and indicted these individuals for child endangerment, for pornography? I mean, they're first graders, guys. Remember, these are first graders. Don't apply your mores to first graders. And then we wonder why it is that we have 5th graders, 6th graders, 7th graders, and 8th graders who say that they want a sex change operation and want to become trans, not just by dressing differently, but actually have the puberty blockers. We wonder why this is a thing. Because they're doing this in first grade. Because they're teaching these children and indoctrinating them in first grade that there is no gender, that you can be whatever you want to be because it's not the way you were born that matters. It's not whether you know you're a guy. You should really try out the whole woman thing too. And these are first graders. I just can't say that enough. It drives me nuts when I hear so many parents talk about absolving themselves of the responsibility of raising children and just having the school system raise your children, or just have daycare raise your children. This is phenomenally unpopular, by the way. I just want you to know this out there now in podcast land. It's phenomenally unpopular to say things like, hey, parents, if you have a kid, you should raise your kid. Apparently, you can't say that anymore, right? It's like, well, parents have to work and they have to be able to drop their kid off at daycare, and sometimes the kid's there for 8 hours a day, sometimes longer because the parent has to commute and so forth. Well, here's the thing. It's the children that I see that have turned out really well and consistent are the children whose parents are truly engaged in their lives and fight back against the Dalton school nonsense, what they're trying to teach first graders. And at the same time, the parents try to do everything they can to spend as much time with their children, including in, like youth soccer or music class or something like that, extracurricular activities where the parents can be present. I understand that we all have to work. We all have to make a living, that sometimes you need to have a daycare center watch your children and care for your child while you're at work. I get it. I understand it. But hear me out on this. If there's any one thing that has come out of this pandemic, it is the fact that we can now, many of us can at least, work remotely. That is one of the best things for children that has ever happened in the last 50 years. The fact that their children, so many children across the country, are going to see their parents more, because the parents can now work from home. They can commute. They don't have to commute to work. They can just stay home and forego the commute. And who's home with them? Their children. They're there when their children leave for school, when they come home, assuming they're back in school, or summertime, they're there all the time because they're working from home. There are other professions, specifically in the trades, where that is not a possibility. You have to go to the place in order to do the work. I get that. That's complicated. And it's understandable that you would need a daycare center for those parents as well. But don't misunderstand what I'm saying. There is at least one good thing about the pandemic that has happened, and that is more parents are home with their children working, and they're able to spend more time with their children. And the other thing is more parents are home with their children as their children have been learning from home in distance learning because of COVID. And the parents are now paying attention to what the children are actually being taught in class. They're actually noticing that in the classroom, there are certain things with certain teachers, not all teachers, certain school districts, not all school districts, that are happening that the parents fundamentally disagree with. And if you really want to affect change, ladies and gentlemen, run for your local school board to affect change, or run for office and implement school choice and educational freedom. That, to me, would be the best thing to happen to this country in a long, long time. And I can only hope that the parents of the Dalton School just start pulling out their children en masse and realize, what an absolute waste of time it is to send your child to a place like that and then only have your child come home, start explaining to you, hey, mommy, I was told it's okay to do these things, and it's not even you that told me this. It was this other teacher, and these people over here are doing that. And it's like, wait a minute, that's my child. Aren't I supposed to be teaching that to my child? So speaking of children, China, according to the BBC News, is allowing 3 children in a major policy shift. So in China, as you know, for a couple of decades, there was a policy in place where you could only have 1 child per family. And that child better be a boy. That was for a couple of decades. And so many parents who had their first child and the child was a girl would have the child either removed, or they would leave the child out in the countryside, hoping that someone would take the child and claim it. And China, of course, tried to put a kibosh on the population for 20 years or so by having a 1 child per family rule. And it was not just, by the way, ladies and gentlemen, a rule, but you see in Marxist societies, when they say 1 child per family and we really want it to be a boy, they mean it. So they actually committed massive infanticide in China during that period of time. So now China has reversed course and allows 3 children in a major policy shift, according to BBC News. And here's what it says. China has announced that it will allow couples to have up to 3 children after census data showed a steep decline in birth rates. I guess China's realized you actually need people in your economy to support the people as they get older. China scrapped its decades-old 1-child policy in 2016, replacing it with a 2-child limit, which has failed to lead to a sustained upsurge in births. The cost of raising children in cities has deterred many Chinese couples. The latest move was approved by President Xi Jinping at a meeting of top Communist Party officials. First of all, think about this, podcast listeners. You got this guy who's at the top of your country. He's the leader. And his Politburo, his insiders, his club, they're deciding how many kids you can have. And the left in America wants to emulate this, right? They want to emulate these people. They want to be like China. They want to, BLM is a Marxist organization. Antifa is a Marxist organization. There are so many Democrats who are de facto Marxists. They just don't even know it because they've never read anything. But here's President Xi Jinping at a meeting of his top Communist Party officials deciding how many children you can have. It will come with supportive measures which will be conducive to improving our country's population structure, fulfilling the country's strategy of actively coping with an aging population, and maintaining the advantage of endowment of human resources, according to the Xinhua news agency. But a human rights organization, Amnesty International, said the policy, like its predecessors, was still a violation of sexual and reproductive rights. Governments have no business regulating how many children people have. Rather than optimizing its birth policy, China should instead respect people's life choices and end any invasive and punitive controls over people's family planning decisions, said the group's China head team Joshua Rosenzweig. Well, so that's what's happening in China. And I really hope that as I leave you today with this podcast, you can understand that any society that has as its top leader someone who thinks that it's okay to tell you how many children you are allowed to have is a society that I never want to see come to the United States of America. It is a society that is so dangerous, so invasive, and it is antithetical to why this country was founded. We got rid of kings. We fled to kings in Europe to be able to get our own freedom and make our own decisions. Yet in China, this is a thing where the premier, the president of China, gets to decide how many kids you have, and Democrats want to become more like China because, I'm sure with Democrats, they don't want more children anyway because of global warming. People are bad. People pollute the environment. People also solve problems, which cleans up the environment. And if we actually focused on that, that would be better. But I digress. Well, anyway, that's it for Mark and Millennials. Thank you for joining Mark and Millennials. This is Mark Fisher. Thank you to our producer, Christopher Hopkins. Check us out on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Parler, Rumble, and our website. See you next time.